Really what we're trying to do is to be a shield, because we know traditionally what is happening is that we have a certain imbalance and undue influences within the minerals and mining sector, whether it means negotiating, agreements, or even selling, what we have as a continent. So what we're trying to do is to champion a common voice, a common agenda, so that when we go to the table, we can attract some sense of respect. We could say that we're trying to get away from the exploitation to the kind of development that is driven and shaped by us who actually have a lot of minerals. As Zachary was talking about, you have countries without minerals but getting the most benefit. And that's because you have the upstream, which is where the producers, where most African countries are. And then you have the midstream, the people that process and let's call them the middlemen or the brokers, and then you have the downstream. Oftentimes the downstream is things like our watches, our iPhones, our cameras. We never get to see them in this conversation. We only deal with the unfairness in terms of how the transaction process is. So what we are achieving through these engagements is to make sure that we set conversations and the narrative and what we want to be able to take home as part of and parcel of the conversation of how do we maximally benefit from our natural resources. We know that these resources have been with us, and we thank God that the more they plunder, the more we get more.
Yes, the more we get.
The more we get, but then we should stop. The time should be now. Yesterday I was in the Discovery Museum in a fantastic place. And one of the literatures that we study in our curriculum in Uganda, where I come from, is things fall apart. Surely, should things continue to fall apart? We think that AFNIS should be the starting point, and they would like to, invite the whole of Nigeria, because the model we build here should be replicated and should be able to implement in other places. So our duty is really to say what's working in Nigeria, can it work in Malawi? Okay, we are built around a few essential objectives, and the first one for me is collaboration. We don't have that a lot on the continent. Can we?
And why is that?
Well, some are historical in terms of how we were shaped. We were a one people, and you see the minerals demonstrate this. They don't know the borders. The geology does not know the borders, but because we had these borders first physically, but now we have them mentally. When I go out and I'm speaking to the strategic partners and promoting Africa, if I say I come from Nigeria, they'll never understand me. I have to say Nigeria, Africa.
Yes.
So the moment they say, "Oh, Africa," so eventually
because they believe Africa is just a state.
Yes, Africa is a state.
It's a state.
Africa is one.
Yes.
So why shouldn't we embrace Africa is one? And that's why we need the collaboration. We have very interesting scenarios where you have an investor in one African country, and then he goes to another country and he's telling them they are being given a lot of benefits, where it's a negotiating tactic. But then that minister does not have sort of like a connection to call this one to say, can you verify for me? Are these people lying? Are you really giving this? So collaboration is really very essential. Resource sharing is another. Most of the other African countries are discovering, for instance, oil and gas. Nigeria has been there for long. Should we make them make the same mistakes that we did? Or should we share with them and say this
so they don't make the mistakes?
Exactly.
So how can that impact the value chain in the solid mineral sector?
Really, there are about 6 enablers that can actually address the whole aspect of the value chain. One that we all struggle with is access to finance, because the mining sector is capital intensive and its return takes longer. So we need to come together and say, how do we support one another to address this financing? Africa has a lot of money, but it's channeled in possibly trade and all the other things we're not getting. So the second one is, of course, policy alignment. Once we all have the same policy, so if you came to Nigeria and the policies are this way, value addition, and you run to the next country, Ghana, you know, it should be the same. If you go to Uganda, it will be the same. I'm happy that the ministries and the governments are collaborating around that. The third is infrastructure development. This is really where the challenge is. Minerals, God has blessed us, never happen in cities. Very rarely. They are always in rural areas, and they need electricity, they need water, they need roads. So that's the third element. The fourth for me is the transparency within the supply chain. This is why I said you don't get to see the downstream, you only see the upstream. Most importantly is building capacity and what we are calling, we have a very young population on the continent, we are very blessed, but they are not skilled enough to take advantage of the opportunities that exist. So even if there are jobs, you could probably not get them. And lastly is the technology. So all of those 6 elements work together to make sure that the value chain, you know, is benefiting
to the average